The target on the back of homeschoolers has never, ever been even half as big as it's getting. We have government-funded homeschooling coming. We have families taking government money to homeschool their kids using government-approved curriculum. I'm worried that we're not going to round this bend in time, that there will be so many government-funded homeschoolers that don't see a problem with the government controlling homeschooling. And in 20 years, 95% of homeschoolers are being paid for by the government to homeschool, and they're tested, and they're tracked, and they're traced, and their curriculum is from an approved list. That's my worry.
Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few, USPI's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and I have another great show for you today. Joining me is Emily Fort, Executive Director of the Homeschool Freedom Coalition, a grassroots movement of passionate homeschoolers united to empower homeschool families and amplify their voices in the political arena. Before we dive in, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating, share the episodes with a friend, and don't forget to visit uspi.org to join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. USPI's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at USPI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspi.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and joining me today is Emily Fort, Executive Director of the Homeschool Freedom Coalition. Emily was homeschooled alongside her 10 siblings, graduated debt-free from college at age 20, and has since dedicated her life to helping families leave the government school system and thrive through home education. Today, she leads a growing grassroots movement uniting homeschoolers to defend parental rights and resist government control. Emily Fort, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Sherry. I'm happy to be here.
So before we get into the work of the Homeschool Freedom Coalition, I'd love to hear a bit about your personal story. So you were homeschooled alongside 10 siblings, count 10.
Yeah. Pray for my mom. No.
And now you have your own homeschool family. So how did that experience shape your passion for liberty and education?
Sure. I grew up with 10 siblings, and my family was one of the families in our state that went to court to make the homeschooling laws there what they were. And so kind of like other folks in my space, like Nikki Truesdell and others, the case was eventually dropped, but it was a legal precedent of sorts that shaped homeschooling in our state. And my whole childhood, my dad would be out speaking at churches and to, groups of parents about the importance of home education, homeschooling. It's legal. It's, we have to take, at the time it was a little scary. It's not scary at all anymore legally. And so that was kind of my childhood, was growing up hearing how great homeschooling was. In my junior year of homeschooling, I decided I want to go to college the following fall. So my junior year, I decided to graduate early, which is not usually when most people decide to graduate early. You should usually start that a few years earlier. But I just asked my mom, what do I have to do to be done with high school? She gave me an enormous stack of books, and I was like, all right, just plowed through it. I went to college in Lynchburg, Virginia when I was 17. And I graduated, and again, because of that massive stack of books and the workload, I got there and I signed up for my 5 classes, and I was like, what else is there to do? This is not enough work compared to my homeschooling in high school. So I went to the class, to the lady at the registration, and I said, how many classes would I have to take in a semester to graduate in 3 years instead of 4? And she said, oh, that's crazy talk, girl. And I was like, no, I think I can do it. And so I did that. So at 17, I went to college. At 20, I graduated. Now, you said I was debt free. Technically, I owed my grandma $1,200, but I paid her back that summer working on a farm. So that was kind of I had experienced personally the benefit of homeschooling. And of course, I thought it was great. But then I had a degree in Christian education, and I was going to teach at a local Christian school. And instead, the year I graduated and came home to teach there, they closed. And I was like, well, what am I going to do with this degree in Christian education? So I went and applied at a homeschool curriculum company near where I lived, and I got hired that day. They were like, you are the person, this is what we're looking for, is someone who was homeschooled and can talk to homeschoolers as a homeschooler. And I would say the 5 years I spent in the office there talking to families, keep in mind, my perception as a student was that homeschooling was wonderful and we got to do lots of fun stuff. I read all these great books, and, we had a big garden and, sourdough bread and the whole 9 yards. Well, I got on the phone with these families and I started hearing horror stories, nightmare stories that you just, like, as a little homeschool kid who went to a little Christian college, you just couldn't fathom this is what some people's 8, 9, and 10-year-old kids are going through. And it was every day. It was every day. And at the homeschool company, they wanted me to have 75 phone calls a day. And I was like, all right. Yeah, you get about 6 or 7 of those calls a day. And by the end of about a month, you're like, your sense of injustice is just, I would say working at the homeschool company, talking to homeschool family or potential homeschool families is what really galvanized my worldview that homeschooling is a society changer. And homeschooling is an imperative. Homeschooling is something, getting our kids out of that system is not optional. I mean, if you heard 10 of the stories I heard on a weekly basis, you just cry your eyes out every day. It was just horrible. And nobody was listening to these families. When they say things are bad in their local Facebook group, people are, yeah, my kid's having a rough time too. And it's just so socially mainstream to have the schools be this bad. And it blew my mind. And I said, I got to do something. We got to do something to help these families, to mainstream homeschooling, to rescue these kids. And so it went from, I enjoyed it and I saw the benefits of it, to we got to help these people. And then once I became a mother and, now homeschooling my oldest is 10, it went from like homeschooling is a benefit to me and my kids to like homeschooling is how we're going to save America. That I really believe that. And so this has been a natural progression in my life. I've gotten to be kind of on the front row seat of this as the government schools have collapsed around us, for all intents and purposes, academically at minimum. So for me, it was a natural step to say, what can we do to defend and advance homeschooling? And that's kind of how I got here. And just on my personal life, it's really funny because I met my husband through Facebook and all these Facebook groups of like-minded conservatives. But we met in person at the Oklahoma City Homeschool Convention. And then we got engaged at the Arlington Convention, and he messaged that he wanted to date me while I was at the Lansing, Michigan Convention. And so all of our anniversaries track to homeschool convention dates. And my first Mother's Day pregnant, I spent that Mother's Day in the Arlington Homeschool Convention, that weekend. And so my whole life has tracked with homeschooling since I was in my, very early 20s. And it's like, I believe God put me on this earth to be a good wife to my husband and a good mother to my 2 children and to do this. So.
Amen. Amen. And I know you're doing an excellent job with it because we've had several conversations, and I'm really excited about this interview and talking about your new opportunity. So you've said that homeschooling is the last great stronghold of parental rights in America. So that's a bold statement. Can you explain what you mean by that and why you believe homeschooling is so central to preserving freedom?
Sure. Well, I would say 2 things. Homeschooling is the last area where parents can say, this is my child. When it comes to their medical care, we all have to live in fear of radical pediatricians and their mandates and, exemption forms and all this stuff. When it comes to what how we discipline them, sometimes even what we feed them, it's almost impossible to find food that hasn't, been tainted by big ag, big food, whatever you want to call it, and heavily processed trash is all we can get for our kids. It's like every angle of parenting has been regulated by the government. In states like Minnesota, if your child says they want to be a different gender and you don't affirm their gender, CPS can come take your kids. It's like this is coming. Education, homeschooling is the last place where you can say, absolutely not. I have total control over what my child is taught. And so that's point one is, we're up against they are trying to take over the last area where parents have total say, and there's no, government entity telling homeschoolers what they have to teach. Now, there are entities telling us how we can discipline or all these other things. But I would say the second point is a little more, upstream of that. Upstream of that is that government schools are self-feeding, right? Government schools create adults that don't have a strong sense of parental authority. They create adults who think that the state is God. They create adults that think that the state should be in charge of education, that the state is good at raising children, that the state, it takes a village. We're sharing this job of raising our kids. And so it's a self-feeding beast, if you will, where they're creating parents that won't care about parental authority, that have been trained to think that the government is going to be a big help and if they make a law that applies to kids, it's for your good. And we saw that a lot during COVID is, a lot of adults raised by government school systems thought that everything the government did was great because it's the government and they're the people who taught us about reality, about our purpose in the world, about everything. And so what we have, homeschooling breaks that cycle. Homeschooling says, you know, no, you're not taking my kids and teaching them that the state is God and teaching them that parental rights are really just for rogue people who don't want what's best for their kids. Homeschooling says, I know what's best for my child, and I'm going to teach them about parental authority. I'm going to, when you say, I'm your mama and I'm going to teach you today, that's essentially you asserting parental authority over your child. When you put your kid on a bus and they go hear from 5 other adults how important this is or that is, or how to understand the world or who you are and what matters in the world, that's essentially handing away your parental authority. You're telling your child, not so many words, these other adults are a source of authority in your life. Homeschooling is the ultimate bulwark against that. It starves that beast. It starves that beast of the next generation of parents who aren't going to advocate for parental freedom, parental rights. And so I think that that's something every homeschooling parent, they don't all know that. They don't realize, and this forays directly into what we're trying to do with the Homeschool Freedom Coalition, but there's a lot of people homeschooling who don't view themselves as these freedom fighters for parental rights. They just view themselves as, I was rescuing my kid from a horrible environment. I was running away from a bad teacher or a bully or poor academics or something. But that's not how the school system sees those parents. The school system sees those parents as radical revolutionaries who are breaking that self-feeding cycle and asserting their parental authority just by homeschooling. And so I think that's, when I say that homeschooling is the last bulwark of parental rights, that's what I mean, is we end the self-feeding cycle and we assert no government body has any right to legislate or regulate what parents do with their own kids in their own house as far as education goes.
You articulated that very well, and that's probably why they're coming after homeschooling. So let's get into your new position, which is the executive director of the Homeschool Freedom Coalition. So you describe it as a movement that makes homeschoolers respected and feared to state legislators. I love that. So what exactly does the coalition do, and why is political engagement so critical right now for homeschool families?
Sure. Well, that like I said, ties right in to what I was talking about. So I was asked to be the executive director of the Homeschool Freedom Coalition 2 years ago. And this has been a thing in process. And I've been, this has been like a dream for 10 years because I see, while parents don't think of themselves as these radical, freedom fighters just by homeschooling, that is not true of the school system. They do view parents choosing to homeschool their kids as, as a hostile act at some level. And if not, only because you're breaking that cycle of them creating their own, next generation, but because they want total control of our children, and we represent money. And so as all these parents pull out for whatever the reasons are, may not be ideological at all, just could be self-preservation. My kid's getting bullied, I'm going to homeschool. Well, that's money leaving the system. And as more and more parents are choosing that, and especially with things like school choice passing all over the country, millions of parents are about to choose this. Every one of those kids represents thousands and thousands of dollars in state and federal funding for the local school district. And so you're not going to just you might want to be left alone in your homeschooling, and that historically that's what homeschoolers wanted, was just to be left alone. We want the government to pay no attention to us. But that era is ending, and that's why the Homeschool Freedom Coalition exists. The reason it's ending is that whether or not you feel like a radical revolutionary doing some freedom fighting by homeschooling your kid, the government school cannot let 10% of the students walk out the door. It can't afford to. The doors would close on basically every government school in the country if 10% of their students walked out. And so they can't let us all leave. They're not going to let all that money walk out the door. And, they just can't. What's happening is the parents who care the most and are the most invested and are the most worried about their kids' future, they're the ones getting out. So as soon as they can, well, what that leaves behind is possibly less engaged parents, possibly less motivated students. So the schools, they know that first 10% to walk out the door is their best 10%. And they need us. They need us badly. And so this all puts a huge target on the back of homeschoolers, whether or not they care to think of themselves as freedom fighters or not. The school system, and I'm not even talking about your local school district. I'm talking about the teachers' unions. I'm talking about the multi-billion dollar industry that is education. And these people have lobbyists, and they've got money, and they've got networks, and they are effective. And so I was looking around, watching this all happen after COVID especially, and it was like, we need a legislative focused homeschool organization that can help homeschoolers. We're trying to go head to head now with the Department of or with the teachers unions, the NEA, and these groups. It's like, you can't go head to head. The tactic of, we're going to crush and obliterate you, with please leave me alone. Like, we're going to get crushed and obliterated. And so the biggest thing that HFC is trying to bring to the scene of homeschooling is a mindset and tactics change. We cannot do this whole thing we've been doing since the 90s of like, please just leave us alone and see how we're good citizens and see how we do free door knocking for Republicans. Please leave us alone. We're no trouble. Our kids study the Constitution. We're not radicals. It's like, that is a losing tactic, and it has been the tactic of homeschool policy for my entire lifetime. And so, and I mean, this all started in a different political climate, and so it was effective then, but we have to be done bringing cherry pies to the Capitol, okay? We aren't here anymore. We cannot take that posture. We're not a small target who's easily overlooked. When it comes to a bad bill to regulate, test, track, trace, vaccinate homeschoolers, what tactic is going to win? The very effective, very well-funded, aggressive, politically savvy teachers unions and the billions of dollars that education represents, or I made you a cherry pie. I mean, it's preposterous. And so we need a mindset shift. That's what HFC, the Homeschool Freedom Coalition, is about. No more, please be nice to me. We have to become really aggressive, and we have to become banded together very effectively, and we need to communicate differently with our legislators. That would be, a couple of the big things we're going to do is we make it very easy for homeschoolers to communicate directly with their legislators about a bill. And we also, and this is the hobby horse of mine, so I'm just going to go on a tangent, which this whole thing has been a tangent so far. But one thing I'll say is, historically, and even up until right now, the tactics of other organizations have been, hey guys, there's a really bad bill in this state, and so if you live in the district of this guy who filed the bad bill, if you live in his district, let him know that you don't like this bill. It's like, how about the tens of thousands, if not more, homeschoolers that live in the whole state that will have to suffer under the consequences of the bill? They should contact him too. Why on earth would we limit the pressure we put on legislators to the homeschool families that live in the district of the guy who filed the bill, right? That's a losing tactic right there. Partially because they often get the most radical reps to file the bill. Well, of course, when you're the most radical dude in town, your district isn't full of homeschoolers. So there might be 6 or 10 families in the district of the guy who's the worst guy who would file a bill to regulate homeschooling. Why would we not unleash 20,000 homeschoolers on them? That's that tactical shift there. That's that mindset shift where we have to be really nice. We just have to be gentlemanly. We just have to be, you know, dignified. I don't know what they want to call it, but it's like we have to be more aggressive. We need to, like, the minute a bill drops, every homeschooler in the state needs to be mobilized, educated, and given the tools to immediately contact their legislator. If there's, obviously it goes through the committee process. We're going to alert every homeschooler in the whole state to pile on those committee members, because when they're acting in a committee capacity, they are representing the whole state. So basically a lot more pressure and a lot more outsized communication. Like we don't have the money of the NEA. Homeschooling does not. By and large, homeschool families are trying to make it, debt free and all the things, and big families and smaller incomes and all this stuff. It's like we cannot compete with the NEA and the teachers unions and all these big ed lobbies with dollars. So we have to compete with our voices, because we, the people, we, the parents, are more effective, or at least could be more feared and respected. And it's like, you just have to think of it from the legislator's perspective. When he has a group of slick, well-funded lobbyists walking his door in their fancy suits, and they're killers, they're cutthroat, they know exactly what they're doing. And they come in there and they say, hey, if you don't vote the way we want you to on this bill, we're going to have to help out your opponent in the primaries. And then you have, like Susie Q. Homemaker, God bless America, homeschool mom walk in, wearing her baby, pushing a stroller, and saying, here, I baked you some cookies. Please don't vote on this bill. We really don't want this. And he goes, who could I bamboozle easier? Who could I win back? Who could I appease after voting the way they don't want? Will it be harder to appease this well-funded, slick lobbyist and their super aggressive agenda, or will it be easier to appease this sweet homeschool mom? So that's the tactics. We have to completely abandon those. We have to take on new tactics. HFC is here to teach people how to do this, to be more effective, to be feared. When those slick lobbyists walk in, they're respected. They are treated to the highest amount of respect and deference. Homeschooling needs that. We need to be treated that way. We need to be seen as a legitimate threat. Part of that ties to the other thing HFC does that no one else is doing in this space, and that is primary work. A lot of times who files the bills and who votes on the bills is determined back in the primary. Homeschoolers have to start getting involved, months and months before these legislative sessions kick off. It's like if we're just going to sit back and let the legislature mix be what it is, we don't have any power then. We have to influence who's taking the seats and who's filling the legislature. And the other thing is, like, even if you get 10,000 homeschoolers to message a legislator and say, hey, this is a really bad bill and homeschoolers are going to be really mad at you, he knows that homeschoolers don't work in primaries. They don't have the money. They don't run ads. They don't educate. They don't mobilize. They wait till a bad bill is filed, and then they freak out and do everything they can to stop it. And he's like, yeah, okay, you know who does spend money in primaries? You know who does exert political pressure? These well-funded NEA, teachers unions, lobbyists, big ed. These people know how to fight in primaries. Homeschooling is completely not involved in the primaries. And so that's where the Homeschool Freedom Coalition is like, yo, we got to get ahead of this game, because in a fair fight of dollars to dollars, we're going to lose every time. We have to get ahead of it. We have to fight differently. We have to be more aggressive. We need to let go of these tactics of appeasement. I'm just happy to, would you sit down and have coffee with me, representative? And that people feel so lucky to have that access. It's like, let me promise you this, the big lobbyists coming in for the billions and billions and billions of dollars of big ed, they're not asking for a cup of coffee. They're at bare minimum, they're getting wined and dined at the best steakhouse in the capital. But aside from that, it's like, we got to stop that mental tactic is a losing tactic, and we got to get rid of it. And that's a big part of what Homeschool Freedom is here to do, is we need to ditch that old way of thinking and that old way of doing politics, because it just doesn't work. And it, especially with the fights that are coming.
Well, it sounds like a very good plan, and I'm so glad that you've been called to do this work. Obviously, from your testimony earlier, you're called into this arena, in addition to, of course, being a mother and a wife. So, and you talked about money. I thought that was interesting, being up against the money. You talked about children representing money, walking out the door. Um, so, so we don't have the money, obviously, as the unions do, but obviously someone is interested in this new paradigm that you're describing, and I think reached out to you to hire you to start this work, and I think that's
Mhm.
wonderful. I
Yes.
don't know if you can talk about that or not, but
I do
it is
not want to share their name, but yes,
okay.
somebody who is known to the homeschool world and trusted for decades reached out to me, and he had been tracking my work for years. And he said, this has to happen. What's moving the needle for homeschooling? Like, God bless all the people that have worked at conferences and run state orgs and had hundreds and hundreds of phone calls getting moms the courage and the tools to homeschooling, to start homeschooling. But what's moving the needle politically? And it's like, homeschooling is not moving the needle politically. Homeschooling is growing not because of us being aggressive, but because of the school failing. Well, then who's going
Mm,
to defend us when finally the sites move to homeschooling? Because this person, he had been invested in the future of homeschooling for decades. And he was like, I don't see people out front of this fight that's coming. And you and your family and the way you think about the world, you're the only people I know that do this. And I said, and he first came to me in 2020. I think that was the first time. And I had just had our youngest. She's 5 now. And I was like, this is just not the year for me. And on top of that,
mm,
COVID happened. And on top of that was the first year I hadn't worked conventions for the homeschool company. So, because, they were canceled everywhere. And they actually canceled, the Fort Worth show was set up and they had the Friday night exhibits or the Thursday night exhibits, but they canceled it the next morning and everyone had to tear down. It was wild. But so they canceled the 2020 shows. He approaches me. I was like, not now. I just had a baby and I really gotta, the whole world's melting down and gone insane. And a year or two later, in 2021, he contacted me again and I said, listen, we're moving, out of the suburbs of Dallas, out in the country a little further. This is not the year for me. And then finally in 22, I was like, I've been praying a lot. And I say this in a lot of videos, a lot of interviews, but it's true. My husband, people might think, how does her husband put up with this? But, I told him when we were dating, and I told this to everybody I dated, like, if you're not ready to talk about homeschooling every day of your life for the rest of your life, you should probably find somebody else because I'm so passionate about this. And my goal was to have 8 or 10 kids and that would be where I put all that homeschool passion and all that desire to see this. God gave us 2 children, and my husband is not tired of talking about it yet. And so when the man came back over and over, and it was like, yeah, this is the time. And then, I mean, just think of how wild in the grand scheme of homeschooling. I know that you probably had these same thoughts at your organization, like right as this is all kicking off, and I'm seeing all these school choice bills pass, which they give me great concern. Some of them give me extreme concern. But right as school choice is passing, Trump gets in and he dismantles the government, the Department of Education. And it's like, this is stuff for homeschoolers. The Department of Education is like the Roe v. Wade of our world. Like when you overturn Roe v. Wade in the pro-life space, that this is like a nuclear bomb that you don't think this is going to happen in your lifetime. And all of a sudden, right as this thing is kicking off, and it was really providential. A whole bunch of things happened. I met a gal who was the perfect counterpart to the skill set I don't have that she does. And it was like, okay, this is perfect. And I was gathering this great team of homeschool moms that were all as passionate as I am. And this man shows up and wants to help us kick off. And then Trump gets in and this whole thing just happens. And it was like, okay, this is really wild. Yeah. So I hope to honor his legacy, and we obviously hope we are growing. We are growing very, very quickly all over the country. We've gotten in some decent sized fights this year already in Texas and in Illinois, Virginia, New Jersey. And yeah, I think our grassroots, it is growing faster than I ever dreamed. So I think we're on the edge. I think a lot of homeschoolers feel like, especially after the death of Charlie Kirk, like the world is changing. and sitting back and letting other people, even great people, even well-meaning, the best intentions, even the best people, letting them fight our fights. We let Charlie fight, for my generation, Charlie fought our fights and we got to sit back and scroll our phones. He's roughly a little younger than me. It's like, we got to get off our tails and we got to fight our own fights because no one's coming to save us. That's how my generation feels, and especially the younger generation. I have siblings that are in their early 20s, and it's like, this is God's timing. This is needed. Yeah, I'm very happy about it. The growth we've seen has been very encouraging. I think homeschoolers are ready to say, hey, I think part of it, and again, another thing, providential, but you have the Make America Healthy movement being the most popular and positive thing in government right now because it's bipartisan. All moms want healthy kids. All moms want healthy food. Well, those moms have been kicked in the teeth and gaslit for a long time about food quality and medications and autism and all these other topics. And it's like, those moms then become homeschoolers and they're radical. I say radical like it's a bad thing, but I mean they're fired up. Well, then homeschooling says, yes, come in and homeschool. And now be very nice and bring pies. And like those moms are like, dude, we're going there to light a fire, not a real one. But we're not going to town to get patted on the head and take a picture with our state rep, man. We're going to the Capitol and they're going to freaking listen to us. Like, you can't have millions of those moms coming into homeschooling from the Make America Healthy movement. Maha is changing the whole shape of all of this. And there's a huge overlap between those people and homeschooling now, and which is great. So it's like, they're not going to take these losing tactics. These old tactics. They were effective in their day, but they're not effective anymore. So yeah,
Right.
I think that's a big mental shift that's happening underneath homeschooling, like replacing ideologically motivated homeschoolers with all these Make America Healthy homeschoolers. It's like, that's changed the tenor of how people want to fight too. And that's another total providential blessing for homeschooling.
Amen. Amen. That's fascinating how you tied all of that together. And it's very encouraging to hear how your movement is growing. So we'll talk more about that, but right now we need to take a short break. And when we come back, I'd like to discuss a recent article you wrote in which you highlight the most recent Nation's Report Card that shows historic lows in reading and math among government school students. Don't go away. I'll be back with my interview with Emily Fort right after this. President Trump's Make America Healthy Again Commission, led by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., released a report in February 2025 identifying corporate influence as a major driver behind the overprescription of medications to children. The report explains that decades of overprescribing has caused unnecessary health risks and long-term damage. Corporate profits and industry marketing strategies contribute to this problem. The Maha Commission's assessment is essential reading for parents who are concerned about their children's health. U.S. Parents Involved in Education hopes this initiative will implement bold reforms to reduce overmedication and improve pediatric health outcomes nationwide. For more information and to join our movement, visit uspie.org and connect with us at USPie on Facebook and X. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today is Emily Fort, Executive Director of the Homeschool Freedom Coalition. Emily, in a recent article, you highlighted some devastating statistics from what's known as the Nation's Report Card. I've actually done quite a few interviews over the last few months on these devastating scores, the steady decline in the NAEP scores, just historic lows. Lots of
Oh, and just to be clear, when they say historic lows, they don't mention, the worst in decades, the worst since they started doing this report card. So they say it's the worst in decades dating back to 1992 because that's when they started testing it. So it's the worst ever.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. So you're right. And of course, after COVID, everybody wanted to blame it on COVID, right? Because of the deep, sharp decline after the COVID lockdowns. But why don't you talk a little bit about your article and share with our audience what the Nation's Report Card, is demonstrating about government schools?
Well, sure. It essentially said what every single parent in America knows, even if it doesn't apply to their child, is that our nation's reading and math scores are the worst they've ever been, ever, since we started testing them. And they're not trending upward really anywhere. You might have a single school district here and there popping off in a good way, but by and large, we're seeing data now that 46% of American high school graduates can't read, are reading at their grade level, less than half. Honestly, I should have looked up the statistics because I've been doing videos on other specific state-specific districts and their data. So I don't want to say the percentages because I've been working on specific states that are different. But I know it was really bad and it was less than half and it was the worst ever, ever, ever recorded. And these are not like, oh, fifth graders are really struggling or eighth graders are really struggling who would be affected the most by COVID, you would think, right? Like the kids who were 7 when COVID hit and missed 2 years of classroom time. Now, these are seniors. So they were, 13, 14 already. They should theoretically have been able to read and write and do math and, have been able to recover from the extreme, change that COVID was. No, our high school graduates are doing terribly. And one thing it's the thing I mentioned earlier already in the interview is that what's happening is as the schools get bad, the most motivated people get out. The most, if they're financially able, if they're, physically able, like I have the time to homeschool my kids, or I have the money to put them in a different education system. Those people are the first ones out, which is making the rest of the schools, all the scores are just getting worse because we don't have those top of the class average families, to help bring up the averages. And so it's getting worse faster because of that. Okay. But then there's this new trendy thing. I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast has seen it or heard of it. It's now we blame the parents. Okay. So now we've given the government education system hundreds of billions of dollars, what is it, like 800 billion a year for K through 12 in America? I think it is. It's insane amounts of money. But now here we are, the worst test scores ever. The academics are collapsing. The best families are leaving as quick as they can to any other option. So what are we going to do? Are we going to look in the mirror and see what we've done? Or are we going to victim blame? And that's what they're doing is they turn immediately. These parents are awful. These parents, they just don't invest in their kids. They don't do the homework. They don't like put them to bed on time. And it's like, stop victim blaming. You raised those adults. You made those parents. You had those parents for 15,000 hours. The same system that taught those parents what's important, that taught those parents how to think, that taught those parents, what's worth doing in life and how important education is and why like adults should put their kids to bed on time. Those people create this. It's a self-feeding machine, like I said earlier. If they're not happy with the parents of all the kids left in the schools, they made those parents. These parents are the result of their system. It's totally symbiotic. It's totally self-feeding. And so for them to turn now and act like, well, these awful parents, it's like, well, why did parents in the 1930s know that their kids should go to school and behave differently and be respectful and all this stuff? Well, then you took those parents, the children of the people in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 70s and the 80s, and you taught them there's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as God. God's a fairy tale. Morals are completely arbitrary and fluid. You find your own truth. You do what's right for you. You make your heart happy. Academics are white supremacy and logic is irrelevant. Well, hey, they learned the lesson really well. You've got a bunch of adults who don't prioritize parenting or they don't prioritize getting their kids' homework done. And it's like, the scores are absolutely through and through a testament to the total failure of the government education system. But the scores are bad, but it's the parents. They made those parents. They were around those parents way more hours than the grandparents were around them.
I love that. I love that. And let me tell you why. Because I do a lot of interviews, radio, a little bit of television all over the country. And often I get the parent blame. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And
it's really victim blaming. If that's what it is it's the parents who are struggling the most and whose kids are being totally failed by the system. Well, it must be your fault. It's like, I'm
Well,
paying my
yeah.
taxes and I'm putting my kid on the bus. Like, I mean, like, just it's wild.
So I took notes because I loved your terminology, victim blaming, because, and I'm always a little nervous to not just jump right in because, you don't want to disparage the host of the show for which you are a guest. Um, but I never agree with them. And I was just uh, on an interview the other day, and I said, I'm always reluctant to blame parents. And I said, I speak to parents. I've spoken to parents
Mhm.
in low income rural communities and honestly interested in their perspective on education. And,
Right.
and, and they're not happy and they love their children. Parents love their children. Sure, there's a few bad apples, and they're
Sure.
always going to have those, whether they're homeschooling or otherwise. But I love your perspective on that. So they are victims of the system and are only behaving the way they've been taught and trained to behave. So love
Yeah.
that, and I'm going to steal that if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it. No, that I mean, I think that what you said is, parents love their kids and it's like, parents across the country are saying, "Hey, you've got my kids for 8 hours a day and then you send home 2 hours of homework and still my kid is failing because I didn't
Mhm.
fit in 2 hours of homework after 8 hours a day." I've got a friend who's homeschooling whose kid is doing way above my kid's grade level and they're getting it done in 3 hours. What
Yeah,
gives? And then
yeah.
it's, "Well, you don't love your kids enough to do 2 hours of homework every night." And it's like, they're a lot of parents are strapped financially. They're working second
Hmm.
jobs. They're driving for DoorDash. Dad works all day, and the minute he gets home, mom takes off for her job. I mean, people are stretched thin. And at the tightest economy, housing is so unaffordable, on and on and on. Right when parents are literally trying to keep food on the table and a roof on their heads over their kids' heads, then you're a failure if our entire school system is collapsing and your kid's getting bullied and beaten up. It's like, I mean, parents can't take any more of that. They're done. They're done being blamed for all this mess. And they're going, dude, I can homeschool my kid for $300 in 2 hours a day. Like, let's go. It's like, anyway,
And
that's, yeah.
now you're reminding me of my daughter-in-law. I was teasing her the other day, and this just shows a generational difference. And this is totally aside from the interview, but I think it's funny because you used the word dude. And I told her
I
the other
did.
day,
I
I
know.
said,
I was like, oh,
I
shoot.
think I think I'm a female. At least let me be a dudette, right?
Right. No,
So
the minute I
anyway,
said it, I was like, that wasn't very professional, Emily.
no, 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 no. I love it. I love that you're being real, and I love the younger generations
Yeah, I mean,
reality that they
so
express.
I'm in my late 30s and I have siblings in their early 20s. My youngest brother is 22 years old. And
Mhm.
if people think, I mean, I know I've talked to some homeschool leadership and I'm seen as you know, what are you, like a bee under the saddle type of person? Like, well, she's just all hot to trot. She's on fire or whatever you want to say. She's super aggressive. It's like, you guys should see 25-year-olds. Okay. I'm the nice cop in the
Yeah.
situation. I am
Right, right.
trying to help homeschooling. The younger generation is absolutely done with this sort of stuffy, trust the guys in the $5,000 suit. Like, they don't trust anybody. They don't trust the news. They've been lied to their whole lives. They've lived through all this, total collapse of a civilization. They see, I grew up in the 90s in a small town in rural America. I basically lived in paradise, compared to what kids are having to go through in government school right now. It's like, they're done being I don't know. I don't want to say gaslit, but they're really done being handled by, people who, "Oh, we know what's best. You guys just let us run the show here." They're not seeing that our leadership has gotten them a lot of great places as young people. And so they're looking for, we need a different approach. We need to be more aggressive. We need to be politically respected, not liked. And so I think the Homeschool Freedom Coalition strongly appeals to younger homeschoolers that are like, who will fight for me? That's it. Is young people, my younger siblings, who is fighting for them? They can't pay for these unending new school buildings that their kids
Mm.
aren't safe in and aren't learning in. They don't want to be taxed out of home ownership. It's already, prices have doubled or whatever in the last 10 years. The economy is not looking to improve anytime soon in any significant way. It's like, They are tired of being guilt tripped that they don't love kids if they don't vote for school bonds. They're tired of being guilt tripped that they're not a good enough parent if they're not, spending 3 hours a day after work on their kids' homework before they go to their second job. It's like they're just done with it. And the sooner homeschooling harnesses that energy, homeschooling needs to harness that energy and move with it. This can move political boulders. This kind of energy can make a difference. And working as a group, working effectively with new tactics, new technology, we can do big things. And I mean, I'm a worldview person, right? Like, I care about my kids, I care about everybody's kids, but ultimately I care about this country. And if we can do this, we can change the shape of education in America. And I think that's something people who went through that system, of course I didn't, people who went through that system can't really fathom a world where government education doesn't look like it does. But we have to look around and every single profession has changed how it looks and how they work dramatically in the last 50 years. Okay, no engineer works the way he worked 50 years ago. He doesn't. Every single profession, doctors completely have changed. We have telemedicine. We have, AI is solving half the medical, conundrums. The lab work, the testing, the amount of change in all these professions is profound. But somehow we're still putting our kids on buses and trucking them to a building to be taught by strangers curriculum we don't agree with. And we have to pay thousands of dollars in property taxes for that benefit. And it's like, why are we not rethinking education from the bottom to the top? Why are we still funding an $800 billion, lemon? like what? We need to rethink education. And I believe that homeschooling can reshape education just by pulling more kids out and saying, no, we are going to have a conversation. You aren't going to just take our tax dollars. I mean, this is something, I know we're just like, I'm a rabbit trail person, but I posted about this on our social media page a few days ago. Is when is the social contract broken between parent taxpayers and the school system? Like, how long do we have to pay them to educate the public because we don't want an uneducated society? How long are we obligated to keep paying for that when they're not doing the job? Like, we have to rethink this whole system. We have to rethink education in the light of all the technology that kids can learn from some of the top minds in the world on their tablet in their living room for free. You can do MIT's classes, tons of them are free online. Like, if you can have access to that kind of education in your home, why are we still propping up this enormous outdated infrastructure? Oh, we need a new building. This one's old. Oh, we need a new building. This one's got a water leak. Oh, it's like, why do we need school buildings at all? Like, honest to gosh, like, think about it. Why are we still doing this? This is like, we don't do the military the same way. We don't do medicine the same way. We don't do any other profession, but somehow education is the same. We've added tablets to the classrooms. That's it. They log their homework on their online at home. It's like, why are we still doing this?
Well, you sound a lot like my colleagues, and especially with our organization, United States Parents Involved in Education. We actually just released a report that the title reads, "Are Government Schools Redeemable?" So I think we're the first organization that has published something like this on the K-12 level, thinking out of the box. It is time. You're absolutely right, Emily. It is time for us to rethink the government education system and why we ever thought it was a good idea to allow the government not only to educate, but to raise our children. So these are the pressing questions that we're asking. And I love your movement and your enthusiasm. And I love the fact that you've shared how young homeschool parents are radicals and on fire for fighting this system, because it is a broken system. It's a failed system. It's a system with an intentional agenda, and it is about the freedom of our country. And that's what I warn many people when I do interviews, is that it's not just about protecting children as though that weren't enough, but it's more about this intentional agenda to change our form of government through the minds of our children. And they are well on their way to doing that, as you know. So I've got another question for you before we take a break, and then we'll close with a couple of questions I ask all my guests. So, for
Okay.
parents listening today, and I think this is very important, for the parents who are worried about government overreach in education, but they feel intimidated by the political process, what are some practical first steps that they can take to get involved and make their voices heard?
Sure. Well, obviously, step one, join the Homeschool Freedom Coalition and sign up for our email alerts and like and follow us on YouTube and other video platforms. We are coming out with video content, how politics really works. And I know homeschoolers are like, oh, yeah, I've seen these videos before. The Bill of Rights and the Constitution and George Washington. No, that ain't politics. Okay. Politics is the adjudication of power. And to be effective in politics, you need to understand how politicians think and what they respond to. And I'll just I'll just get out the gate here. They don't respond to being educated. Okay. We don't need to teach the politicians that the Constitution says XYZ. And we don't need to educate the politicians that parents have the right to do ABC. They do not need to be educated. They need to be forced to do something. So they're being forced. There are powers and pressures. That's what politics is, the adjudication of power. There are powers and pressures in the Capitol making politicians do everything they're doing. Money, lobbyists, their biggest fear is losing their seat because that's how they matter. They don't matter if they're Joe Blow nobody at home, They don't care to be that guy. So to keep their seat, which is their ultimate, total, final end goal, is to keep their seat, they have to respond to pressures. And so the question is, and we're going to teach people how to do this in video content coming out over the next several months, especially the legislative session kicks off almost everywhere in January. A couple of states like Ohio and Pennsylvania go year round, pray for them. But anyway, so what we're going to teach people how politics really works. Legislators they don't want to be educated by you about the benefits of a free market. They don't care to be educated. They'll put up with you. They'll thank you so much for this Constitution for my pocket. They'll thank you so much for this excellent Thomas Sowell book. Thank you so much for coming by and telling me that you're concerned about this bill. Have a great day. Goodbye. But if you don't bring pressure to the legislature with you, hi, I represent 10,000 homeschoolers. We've been emailing you and texting you and calling you, and we're pretty ticked. Now you have some power. Now you have pressure. And so we have to stop. Again, this is a tactic shift, right? Stop thinking of, doesn't he know the Constitution doesn't allow this? He doesn't care what the Constitution says. We don't need to educate him. We don't need to homeschool him. We need to force him to do the right thing, even if it's against his will or her will. And that's a total mental shift for homeschoolers and honestly for conservatives across the board. For pro-life, for pro-gun, for whatever your topic is, we've got to move to, that's what the left is doing and to great effect. And so step one for people that want to start getting involved, sign up for our emails, sign up for our alerts, join as a member. Donate if you're able, obviously, but start watching the videos on how politics really works and then get to know your legislator. And I would say, it's a little edgy, right? But don't go in there and talk to them or pick up the phone and call them with a posture of subservience anymore because they've had that for decades. People who assume that posture are easy to step on. But if you call and say, hey, I'm really not happy about this bill, which again, presuming there's a bill, if you're just calling to meet him, that's kind of rude. But, I'm really unimpressed with this bill, or I really don't want you to vote this way on this bill, or I really do want you to vote this way on this bill. Well, then, thank you so much for your time. I'm just so eager to speak with you. I'm just so lucky to have you on the phone. No. If you're going to do that, don't call. It's better off to call and say, hi there, I'm a concerned parent who votes and donates. And my kids have done door knocking for lots of candidates in this district. And I'm hearing some concerning things. Could you tell me what's going on with this bill? Okay, I'll be watching very carefully how this vote happens or how this bill moves forward. There's just a tone difference. And then imagine if you had, their staffer has to tell them, hey, we've gotten 25 calls like that today. It's I can't clean that up with a picnic in the park. I can't clean that up with a, boots and barbecue, fundraiser. I can't clean that up with a, what do they call it in, it's corn and conversations in the Midwest. You can't fix that with a $500 fish fry. You have to actually deal with motivated voters. And so just the posture change is a big part of it, learning how politics really works, working. A big thing is when we put out an alert, take action. When we tell you this bill is bad or it's good, this guy needs to hear from you now, make the calls, send the email. We make it really easy. Just click the button, choose from the 5 pre-written emails we give you, and it will send directly to the legislator, your legislator. You don't even have to know their name. We make it as easy as possible so people can communicate. But it's like, number 1, take action. Number 2, change your mindset. And, all of that. We're going to help people do that going forward. So,
Excellent. Excellent. Sounds like a really good plan. And I'm hoping that you're doing a lot of interviews like this so that more and more people will know what you're doing. I know my daughter-in-law, for one, is going to be fired up after she hears this
oh,
interview.
nice.
And I no doubt she will be joining your coalition. So I need to take another short break, Emily, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you 2 questions I ask all my guests before closing the show. So don't go away. I'll be back with my interview with Emily Fort right after this. Government schools are failing students on multiple fronts, including academic achievement, critical thinking, attendance, and mental and physical health. A 2025 survey found that a whopping 73% of adults are dissatisfied with the quality of public education. The United States Parents Involved in Education is asking a bold question in our new report. Are government schools redeemable? The report explores 5 major obstacles: government overreach, corrupt teacher training, flawed certification systems, failed standards and assessments, and the destructive power of teachers' unions. Still, the U.S. PI report offers practical insights and suggestions for those determined to try to improve the government system. Visit uspie.org for more information and to download this groundbreaking report. To join our movement, visit uspie.org and connect with us at USPie on Facebook and X. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today has been Emily Fort, Executive Director of the Homeschool Freedom Coalition. Emily, we close our show with 2 important questions. What concerns you most about what's happening in education today, and what gives you hope?
Sure. So I think those are both good questions. The thing I'm most concerned about is, are we going to make this turn in time? That's I lay awake at night and pray, and I ask God to please help homeschoolers make this turn in time, because we've had a lot of years of relative ease and a lot, it's relatively safe. Very, very few families are being persecuted or prosecuted for homeschooling. It's been legal and safe for decades, almost everywhere. Yeah, there are obviously egregious cases, CPS cases especially, but we've not kept up with the fight that's coming. And it's like, I'm very concerned that homeschoolers are going to be so stuck trying to be nice and kind and keep doing what they've always done that we're not going to make the turn in time. And there's going to be regulation and legislation that, once it's on the books in one state, will then be used in a domino effect to be the basis of legislation in other states. And so I really pray often that we get ahead of this turn, that we round this bend and start thinking and acting very differently. I'm worried the target on the back of homeschoolers has never, ever been even half as big as it's getting. And then I live in Texas, right? So they just passed a school choice bill here in Texas. I did not like this bill. We fought this bill, went to Austin several times against this bill. But of course, at the time, we're barely off the ground. And at the time, Jeff Yass put $24 million into the Texas primaries. Again, the primaries that I keep talking about. If he basically flipped the 11 House seats he needed, that were the 11 no votes on school choice last time. So he flipped those 11 seats. I mean, he meaning his PACs, but he spent his $24 million, flipped the 11 seats he needed, got his 11 yes votes, ran through school choice. And now here in Texas, homeschooling in Texas has always been rather ignored. We have the Leeper versus State of Texas decision years ago, and homeschooling has been, largely legal, safe, nobody bothers you. I know when I worked at the homeschool company, it was like, oh, you live in Texas, you don't have to worry about anything. They're not going to do a thing to you in Texas. Well, now we have government-funded homeschooling coming. We have families who have no ideological commitment to homeschooling as a concept, but only to their kid escaping from a bad situation, taking government money to homeschool their kids using government approved curriculum. And I'm worried. I'm worried that we're not going to round this bend in time, that by the time homeschoolers wake up and realize that our tactics are not effective for the fight we're in, that there will be so many government funded homeschoolers that don't see a problem with the government controlling homeschooling, that a homeschooling essentially becomes just basically in 20 years, all education is government education, all of it. That's my worry, is we're not going to round the bend in time. And in 20 years, 95% of homeschoolers are being paid for by the government to homeschool, and they're tested and they're tracked and they're traced and their curriculum is from an approved list. And yeah, that's my worry. So that all sounds very doom and gloom. Obviously, I do lay awake at night worrying about it, but God is faithful. God is in control. And so I'm doing what I can do to wake up more people and make sure that doesn't happen. So pivoting to what gives me hope is there are more homeschoolers already than I ever dreamed there would be in my lifetime. And there are more parents waking up faster since COVID. My husband and I, we are very, very, very worldview oriented people, and we don't sit around and talk about sports. I don't even know how football is scored or soccer. I don't know anything about that stuff. I talk about politics and worldview stuff, and my husband and I sit here at night and we're like, I would never have believed the things that have happened that are so great have happened. Like, I would never have believed Roe v. Wade could be overturned. I would never have believed that the Department of Education could be effectively dismantled. I would never have believed that, we'd see this kind of resurgence and growth in homeschooling and parental rights. I would never believe so many people recognize the danger of, the government mandating medical procedures, right? We have a lot of reason for hope. We're seeing, growing up as a kid, people who thought what I think about the world were the tiniest sliver of a fringe. We were the frayed edge of the fringe. And it's like now there are millions of parents going, hey, wait a minute. Yeah, these people taught me what to think about the world, but I think they lied to me the whole time. I think on 20 topics, on education, on the economy, you just work and pay your taxes and you'll be fine. It's like, well, turns out that wasn't true. A whole bunch of people became super, super billionaires, doing insider trading. And the rest of us are here paying 3 times for this house what it cost 10 years ago. Like that didn't pan out. I got to stop trusting these people. I guess fundamentally the thing I have cause for hope, aside from the fact that I'm commanded to hope by scripture, so I will hope, because I must. But aside from that is people are waking up, and they're waking up across a variety of topics. I always say that homeschooling is something of a gateway drug, but any one of these is a gateway drug. If you came in on the, my kid was vaccine injured and nobody believes me, that's a gateway drug. All of a sudden you're into homeschooling, you're into, all sorts of stuff. You saw right through COVID in 2 seconds, and any one of these topics is a gateway to a different worldview. And I think a lot of people are waking up, and that encourages me. That gives me a lot of hope that God is doing big things. God is, in the day-to-day grind of our economy and homeschooling and all the stuff, it can feel like we're just losing. But ultimately, if you step 1,000 feet up and look at the huge changes that have happened just in the last 10 years, God is doing things with America. God's doing things for parents. God's doing things for his church. And, you would think that the death of Charlie Kirk would have devastated everybody and just been further demoralization, further evidence that our society is just falling apart at the seams. And instead it was like God used it for enormous good. God used it to wake up the church. He used it to wake up parents. It's like God is doing big things with small actions. And so we just have to take the small actions and be faithful to him.
Amen. Amen. Well, what a good conclusion, and what a very hopeful vision you have. And so I'm sure but our mission at United States Parents Involved in Education is to close the U.S. Department of Education and end all federal education mandates. It's been our mission for 10 years. So when you said that that's a really big deal for homeschooling, and especially for the kind of political activity that you're talking about, just keep in mind that we should definitely be allied and help each other in any way that we can. We're, of course, excited about the progress that's happening with the president's executive order. There's a couple of bills in Congress that we're following. Congressman Moore's bill from Alabama, in particular, we think is the best bill, and we'd like to see a friendly amendment to it that would allow tax credits for parents as a way of bundling the
Yes.
funds back to states. We think
Yes.
a
Tax
portion of that
credit.
money, yes, it needs
Yes.
to go directly to the families who don't have children in government schools, and then the rest of it they can bundle up and give to the state, and they can spend it through the government schools however they
Amen.
choose.
That tax credits are the way forward. That's the only way forward that we don't end up entangled in regulations and restrictions and testing and tracking and medication and all the other mess. The only
Right.
way is through tax credits. Everything
Yeah.
else is a risk.
Well, keep that in mind so that we can collaborate when we need to as
Yeah, no,
organizations.
I'm happy to. Yeah.
Okay, so before we close, tell our audience how they can find out more about the Homeschool Freedom Coalition. Where can they
Sure.
find you?
Yeah, we are on social media as the Homeschool Freedom Coalition on all, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. And then our website is homeschoolfreedomcoalition.org. You can find us there. You can sign up for email alerts. You can become a member. Yeah, that we'd be thrilled to have you. We're growing very quickly. The team of gals here that thought we were getting into something part-time, it's like we are excited at what God is doing. We need all hands on deck for this fight. This is I really, I resent the fact that Joe Biden got the phrase, we're in a fight for the soul of our country, because you can't say that. That's too good. I want to say that, but I do feel like homeschooling is that fight, and we need every single person that homeschools or cares about the future of education or cares about what their grandkids are learning or
Mhm.
we need everybody in this fight, because if they get to keep teaching our kids, they're going to keep teaching our kids to destroy our country. And
That's
we've
right.
got to stop it.
That's right. Absolutely right. So thanks again, Emily, for joining us today. And to our listeners, if you found today's discussion eye-opening, please share this episode with a friend, give us a 5-star rating, and subscribe to stay informed. You can connect with us on Facebook at X@USPI and visit uspie.org to join the movement. Until next time, I'm Sherry Few. Thank you for your support of USPI and our efforts to unmask government schools.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, USPI seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional USPI chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapters section.